Bom, vamos dar início aos trabalhos da primeira sessão. O tema instituições multilaterais e políticas de desenvolvimento poderia ser abordado de vários âmbitos. Nós vamos assistir agora a um tratamento do tema que foca a questão das políticas de defesa da concorrência, um campo onde também, assim como tantos outros, as instituições multilaterais têm avançado em iniciativas tentando moldar a forma de regulação adotada nos países em desenvolvimento. Nós vamos assistir primeiro à apresentação do trabalho do professor Argides. Foi distribuída uma cópia com algumas páginas, com números e as principais colocações. Assistiremos depois o trabalho do professor Argides justamente sobre a OMC, a proposta de uma regulação uniforme nos países de desenvolvimento e países desenvolvidos na defesa da concorrência. Depois, assistiremos uma apresentação do Alberto Salazar sobre redes de pequenas empresas e seu papel na competitividade e na concorrência. E depois, finalmente, encerraremos com os comentários do professor Luciano. E será aberta a palavra a todos vocês também para intervenções, questões, comentários. Então, sem mais demoras, passo a palavra para o professor Argides para a sua apresentação.
Please forgive me if my voice is soft. I have Parkinson's disease. And so, if you are unable to hear me, just indicate so that they can make the adjustments to the microphone. It's my first time in Brazil, and it is a great privilege to take part in this seminar. Celso Furtado, the great Brazilian intellectual and a leading figure in third world development economics. Indeed, one of the creators of the idea of that word. It was a great pleasure and privilege for me to have him give a seminar in Cambridge many years ago. So it is with a sense of humility that I dedicate this lecture as a tribute The third world is faced with a rather different set of economic problems today than in the past. And these are problems about microeconomic behavior of economic units, and microeconomic conditions in developing countries. In the past, microeconomic analysis of what goes on inside a developing country is regarded as a prerogative of the country itself. But the times have changed. Competition policy and competition are my subjects. Together with corporate governance, labor laws, and other institutional arrangements, are now regarded as a part of the international concerns, where what you do inside the country is subject to international scrutiny. The emphasis on these micro-corporations stems from the Asian crisis, where after the dust had settled down, the leading US officials, Treasury economists, IMF, ascribed the root causes of the Asian crisis to the Asian way of doing business. It was argued that the crisis did not lie, well, macroeconomic disequilibrium may have been a trigger for the crisis, but it was a crisis waiting to happen because of the deficiencies in the internal structures of these countries. Alan Greenspan put the matter very well. He said the whole of the Berlin Wall marked the end of socialism as a way of organizing economic activity. But he went on to say that what emerged from this from this event was not one capitalism, but two capitalisms. What he called the free market capitalism of the United States and the United Kingdom, and the state-directed capitalism of East Asian countries. Well, he said for 10 years, nothing could be said about the state-directed capitalism because it was growing at 10% a year. But the crisis shows that it was always fragile and wasn't able to withstand international competitivity based on liberalization. So the IMF took the same view, and as part of its conditionality, imposed far-reaching changes in competition policy, in labor laws, in other institutional arrangements of developing countries, to the extent that a conservative US economist, Martin Epstein, felt compelled to protest, to say that IMF has no business to be imposing on these new institutional arrangements which they had demonstrated they do not want, but only as a part of the liquidity crisis these countries were experiencing. We thought these reforms may be useful, but they should come through the political processes internally rather than being imposed from outside as a part of conditionality. The IMF followed the notion that the crisis was caused by overinvestment, and overinvestment was due to the fact that neither the mechanism of corporate governance nor competition was strong enough to stop Asian firms from continuing to invest even when their profitability was quite low. So the argument was that this led to overinvestment, which in turn reduced profits and ultimately led to the crisis. Now, this story has of course many aspects, some of which I've examined in other papers, but today I will look at the question of competition. And the main thesis I'll be trying to establish is first that, contrary to what people may have thought, competition in emerging markets is very strong. That domestic competition as well as the intensity of competition in emerging countries is very strong. Secondly, I'll argue that despite this more intense competition in developing countries, we still need a competition policy. The reasons for this lie in the international factors mainly, but also in domestic factors. The third point I would argue is that this competition policy should be specific to each country's circumstances and the level of development. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all competition policy. I will argue specifically that the US and the UK competition policies, the European Community competition policies, are a poor model for developing countries. Japan and Korea provide better models. I would then suggest that in a global economy, which is where the key players are the multinationals, what is required is an international competition policy, not just domestic competition policy. And I would propose the creation of an international competition authority to be able to deal with the activities of the multinationals and to be able to provide contestability in the world market spaces. So I will need to be brief, go over this agenda, but the papers on which these observations and remarks are made are available from the department later on. Now, the first question is, how much competition is there in developing countries? Well, it's a difficult question to answer because there is very little hard information. You might think you'll be able to get at least data on 3 or 4 concentration ratios. The simplest kind for a large number of countries, but it's not true. You only get it for a small number of countries. And this is reproduced in table 1. What it shows is that developing countries such as India and Korea have concentration ratios which are comparable to advanced countries. That might indicate, therefore, a lack of competition. The same kind of idea comes from the fact that in many developing countries there are barriers to exit. Firms are not allowed to leave the industry when they have very low performance because the governments don't want large number of unemployed. Similarly, Professor Reform argued that African countries don't have much competition because of fragmentation of markets and because of small size of these markets. On the other hand, the Harvard Professor Porter argues that in Korea the competition has been intense. So, what does one make of these stories? Table 2 provides data on dualism in advanced countries and developing countries. And what you find there is that developing countries, something like 60 to 70% of industrial production comes from small-sized companies employing investment can go this, which is a comparable proportion in the United States to be 4 or 5%. So these are dual economies in which there are very large number of small firms and a modern industrial sector which contributes very greatly to production, but it consists of a small number of firms. Now, what my colleagues and I did was to measure the intensity of competition, to have a dynamic measure of how intense the competition is by using the persistence of profitability methodology, which is employed in a number of studies for advanced countries. So I applied exactly the same methodology and found the results which are reported in tables 3 to 5. Basically what these tables show is that the 7 countries, developing countries which I was considering, Brazil, India, Jordan, Korea, Indonesia, Mexico, the persistency coefficient member, as well as indicators of long-term competition intensity, were persistently lower for developing countries than for developed countries. So it's a counterintuitive proposition which comes out of the data that if you follow exactly the same methodology, developing countries have more competition, more intense competition than advanced countries. Now, you might say there is perhaps some statistical problem with this, but we have investigated these, and the results are quite robust to alternative specifications and different kinds of objection which can be raised against this result. I think the main point is that there are good economic reasons to observe what we observe. Just as there are structural factors which are anti-competition in developing countries, there are also structural factors which are pro-competition. And specifically, the costs of setting up new firms tend to be lower in developing countries than in advanced countries. And also, the government is not always anti-competition, but arranges contest-based competition in many developing countries. That is to say, government awards subsidies to firms on the basis of a contest of these subsidies, on the basis of performance standards, so that this contest-based competition can substitute market-based competition and in many respects more efficient. And as I said, some costs in developing countries there are also other kinds of evidence which supports the same notion that that's evidence based on turnover studies, entry and exit of firms. The turnover is greater in a small number of countries for which these studies have been done for developing countries than in countries like US and UK. So there's a similar Starbound has done a comprehensive survey of the literature on competition in developing countries in the Journal of Economic Literature. He said, although the issue remains open, the existing empirical literature does not support the notion that LDC manufacturers are relatively stagnant and inefficient. Turnover rates in plants and jobs are at least as high as those found in the OECD, and the amount of cross-plant dispersion in measured productivity rates is not generally great. Also, although small-scale production is relatively common in developing countries, there do not appear to be major potential gains from better exploitation of scale economies. So my results confirm what Tybolt is saying. Now, despite the fact that developing countries, at least the leading developing countries, have a subject to quite intense competition, it is still useful to have a competition policy, both domestic and international. The reason for domestic competition policy is that there has been large-scale privatization in many countries and deregulation, and one doesn't want private monopolies to replace public monopolies, and that's part of the competition policy. At the same time, the international merger movement is creating huge corporations which deny or at least diminish the space available for developing country corporations to expand in the future. Now you might say that the international merger movement is a way of increasing efficiency of the world economy. But detailed evidence suggests there is no truth in this claim at all. There are two ways in which mergers can improve efficiency. One is through the threat of takeover. The second is through the act of takeover itself, which may lead to synergies and economies of scale and scope, even when two companies are performing as well as they could, but combined together, their social product will be large. But when you look at these two mechanisms, it turns out that selection in the market for corporate control doesn't take place just on the basis of performance, profitability. I mean, the folklore of capitalism is that the strong take over the weak. Strong being in terms of profitability and performance. But the actual reality is that it's the large which take over the small, regardless of how well they perform. A large company with relatively small profits has much greater chance of survival in the market control than a small company with large profits. And one of the ironies of this is that a large company can keep becoming larger through the takeover process itself, so that the market of corporate control does not act as a constraint on, or as an adequate constraint on large firms, which is what it's supposed to do. So, therefore, it is necessary for developing countries to be able to control the activities of multinational companies, particularly their merger activities. And I'll make some proposals shortly in that regard. competition policy should developing countries have. One view was put forward by Professor Bond, late Professor Bond, French industry organization Congress. I quote him from his presentation in your handouts. He says that competition is an unambiguously good thing in the first best world of economists. That world assumes large number of participants in all markets. No public goods, no externalities, no information asymmetries, no natural monopolies, complete monopolies, fully rational competence, a benevolent whole system, most complex, and a benevolent government provided lump-sum transfers to achieve any desirable distribution. Because developing countries are so powerful in this part of the world, it is not always the case that competition should be encouraged. You argue because in the real world, the economist conditions are unlike it may be better for developing countries not to have competition. I think Professor Lafon is being unduly pessimistic here. He has a general point. But there are many developing countries, countries like India, China, Mexico, and I can name others, which have a record of good management, of achieving fast economic growth, over long periods of time. Latin American countries up to 1980 achieved growth rates of 5 to 6% a year. The governments played a major role in this process, as they are doing in India and China today. So the question is, if you have a reasonably effective government, what kind of competition policy developing countries should have? Now, the basic problem with following the British or the American model, or the EEC model, is that these policies are generally based on static efficiency and on advancing the consumer interest, so that they try to maximize competition and minimize profits in order to benefit the consumer. But the problem is that for a developing country, this cannot be a good outcome, because the essential issue is how to increase the rate of investment. And the rate of investment depends on profits. And so profits are both the spur to investment, as well as make possible the financing of investment. And therefore, there may be a conflict between industrial policy and competition policy. And in this conflict, in developing countries, it's important that the industrial policy should prevail over competition policy. And this is precisely what was done in Japan and in Korea. If you look at Table 6, it shows you the cartelization policy, domestic cartels, which were promoted by the Japanese government during a period of high economic growth between 1950 and 1970. The government encouraged all kinds of cartels in order to ensure that the rate of profit does not fall, that as a result of recessions, animal spirits which lead to high rate of investment in the private sector still exist. So, in that sense, the discussion which has been going on at the World Trade Organization on the question of the link between investment and competition, they do not address the question of appropriate competition policy for developing countries in a meaningful sense. They don't provide any new concepts or any new definitions to say what would be the outcome of these policies for developing countries. The new proposals by the European Commission, European Community for a multilateral competition policy are not very helpful, because although they say that they are concerned only with hardcore cartels, and that as a minimum competition policy for all countries, on which everyone can agree, they're not asking the same competition policy. But this inference is not quite correct, because they're asking developing countries to accede to the WTO norms of market access, national treatment, that multinationals should be given national treatment, as if they were part of them, as if they were national firms. There should be no discrimination in the foreign firms and national firms. Now, in order to deal with these problems, I argued for an international competition policy, which would have companies to expand by internal growth, organic growth, not through mergers. They can expand through mergers, provided they divest a subsidiary of equivalent size from their portfolio. But they can, of course, grow as long as they grow by internal means, so that there is no limit to the growth of the multinational companies, except that the method of mergers should not be used in order to achieve that aim. Now, when I presented these proposals at another place, they said to me, these are radical proposals, and how would you ensure, why would developing advanced countries agree to them? Well, they may look radical to you today, but they were not radical when they were proposed by Senator Kennedy in relation to the US corporations in 1980. But of course, times have changed. So must be. Thank you very much.
Buenos días a todos. Does it sound like a Portuguese? Or I'm trying to learn a little bit of Portuguese. Well, thanks very much for inviting me to share this table. I'm coming from Toronto, and it's been a really very dramatic change to me, coming from 0 degrees weather to 25 or 20 degrees. So I'm still coping with the warm weather, which I'm enjoying it. It's a real pleasure for me to share this table with Professor Ayi Shin and Professor Coutinho. Let me begin this short presentation on this topic. The title of this presentation, you can read in this slide, is on building networks of small firms to accelerate industrialization in developing countries. I guess in Spanish that would be like construyendo redes de pequeñas empresas para acelerar la industrialización en los países subdesarrollados. El papel del derecho de la concurrencia Does that sound good? El papel de derecho de la competencia. Let me just introduce the topic and present the main claims that I would like to make today. If I make a survey and ask most economists this question, would you agree with the idea of allowing or permitting firms to fix prices or to negotiate with other partners collectively? Probably most economists will say, no, I don't. I think that is a wrong idea. We shouldn't allow firms to fix prices. We shouldn't allow firms to bargain collectively. Well, my presentation today will question that idea. My presentation today will challenge that conventional view. And the central idea is that fixing practices such as fixing prices perhaps is a good practice. It's very important for small firms to compete in a very fierce local, national, and international competition. Small firms are very important for developing countries. Smaller firms, we can think of the micro firms or fairly small firms, but practices such as fixing prices may be very, very advantageous to small firms. Small firms are very important for developing countries' economies. We know that our countries are run by, for sure, for large firms, but also by small firms. Small firms are very important for providing jobs for low-income people, for distributing wealth in the society, and perhaps most important for us is that small firms are maybe a source of innovation and industrialization in developing countries. Well, but that's just one important finding that we have to assume. But my topic today is to ask whether competition law, derecho de la concurrencia, that sounds weird, I don't know. Whether competition law and policy has a role in promoting networks of small firms, in promoting cooperation, collective action, collective strategies by small firms. So the central argument that I will make is that yes, competition law and policy do have an important role in promoting cooperative practices by small firms. And this, as I said before, this departs from traditional view of market competition, in which individual firms are supposed to compete individually without controlling or fixing any condition of the market, including fixing or including setting market prices. So I suggest that there are three very important policy ideas that competition law and policy should take into account. The first one is that competition law should induce, promote cooperative networks of small firms. Perhaps the clearest example of this is allowing, permitting cartels of small firms. For instance, to fix prices in times of recession, to fix price to compete with large corporations, to fix price to survive when they are facing some stagnation situation. Another interesting example of inducing cooperative networks is facilitating the joint action by small firms. For instance, legally, small firms may be allowed to purchase goods, services collectively. They get together. Instead of negotiating with, say, with a big buyer or a big supermarket, they meet together, probably make, let's say, 10 or 20 small firms meet together before going to negotiate with this large buyer and agree on the general terms that they will present to this large buyer and go and negotiate collectively rather than individually. And competition law could allow these collective actions to occur legally. A second important policy idea in the same line of argument is to protect cooperative networks of small firms. Perhaps one very important example is to control exploitative or unfair terms and conditions in subcontracting relationships. You may know that a good number of small firms supply parts or components to a large company. You may know also that large, small firms supply goods and services to large supermarkets. Supermarkets, as you know, supermarkets where we perhaps buy goods and services, they basically buy their products from smaller firms. So what I'm suggesting here is that relationship between small suppliers supplying goods to supermarkets or to big corporations, that relationship should be controlled by competition law. And competition law could establish some controls on the terms and conditions of that relationship. Perhaps one very common problem in this regard has been late payments by large firms. In Japan, in Latin America, large firms tend to delay payments to smaller suppliers. They tend to cancel orders without any notice. They tend to say, you know what, if you want me to buy your goods and services as a supermarket or large buyer, I would say, if you want, you small guy, small firm, if you want me to buy your products, you know what, you have to pay me an additional fee because I want to say, if I want to put your products on the shelves of the supermarket, you have to pay me a little more money. And small firms usually have no choice. So they have to simply accept those unfair conditions. And they lose money, they lose capital, they lose power. And eventually a supermarket might say, you know what, I don't want any more buying products. And small firms usually don't have the choice to say yes or no. So competition law could control that unfair relationship and say, you are very big, you are a large corporation, but you are not allowed to abuse your power over this small firm. Why? Because small firms are very important for providing jobs for low-income people, for innovating, introducing innovation, for developing new technology, for industrializing this poor country. But again, another important example of protecting cooperative networks is by removing discriminatory practices in cooperative networks or some sort of linkages in a small firm. Let me give you another example. We know that there are a good number of trade associations in any economy. You have, the Association of Large Firms working in the, say, biotechnology area, etc., etc. So you have, in society, you have several trade associations or business associations, and usually large firms control these trade associations. The board of these trade associations are controlled by large firms. Small firms usually have no voice in making, in contributing to the decision of the trade association. They have no any sort of a policy protection to favor small firms. So in cases such as trade associations or business associations, even business clubs, small firms usually are not allowed to participate in that decision-making process. And that may have a negative impact on the performance of the small firm. So competition law could say, you know what? Small firms are very important for this economy. You guys, you're very big, you are very knowledgeable, you have very good experts, you have a lot of money, but let these small guys to participate in the board of the trade association, because we need to hear their concerns, we need to hear their interests. And competition law could facilitate that inclusion of small firms in trade associations, in business clubs, even business clubs, in some sort of a business networks where large firms or even smaller firms develop new competition policies and develop or create new business opportunities. A third very important policy idea that competition law could take into account is regulating the competition between networks or groups of small firms. Now this idea again may sound a little rare to economists, because we tend to view competition, market competition, in terms of individual action by firms. What I'm suggesting here is that perhaps in developing countries, we need to also to look at the collective or group competition and say, if small firms need to cooperate among themselves and act collectively, then maybe we need to rethink competition in terms of collective or group competition. And this, perhaps, it's very important because contrary to the conventional view, large firms usually develop strategic alliance with other local large firms. Large firms usually tend to develop strategic alliance with large corporations, international corporations. So, as Professor Aitchison was mentioning, competition law could intervene in these situations and say we need to control the action of this group of large firms operating in the economy, trying to control local economies, and some sort of protect the collective action by small firms. So three key policy ideas. Inducing cooperative networks of small firms, protecting the cooperative networks of small firms, and regulating the competition between networks or groups of firms. Now, these ideas may sound very interesting theoretically speaking, but let me just show you some concrete examples of how competition, or what competition may look like in order to facilitate these cooperative networks or small firms. I bring to the discussion three interesting cases. I call this section the non-Anglo-American trends, to mean that beyond Canada, the US and the UK, there are other models of competition law that are more sensitive, more responsive to small firms. And I would argue that there are three important cases that we need to consider and to draw some lessons from this country to develop competition law and policies that are more sensitive to the needs of cooperative behavior by small firms. The first case is Germany. I don't have time to go into the details of the German competition law, but let me just say only that in Germany, competition law facilitate and legally permit cartels of small firms. Small firms could act collectively, for instance, to go to a large company and say, we together want to buy these parts and components. And so they are legally allowed to bargain collectively. And they have obviously more power than going individually. That's a very common sense idea. So in Germany, they are allowed to negotiate, to buy parts, components collectively. And a typical form that this action takes is by having cartels of small firms. Japan, second very interesting case. Professor Aki-Singh has mentioned that already. I'm going to draw on the ideas that Professor Aki-Singh has been basically arguing for the last 5 years. In Japan, we have a similar competition law. Competition law allows cartels of small firms to operate. Moreover, in Japan, there are several legal regulations that control supply and subcontracting relationship between small firms and large firms. For instance, in Japan, in the past, there has been the subcontracting law, or the late payment, delayed payment law, which was basically enacted to impose on large firms the duty to pay to small firms on time. Don't delay payments. Don't cancel orders. Do it right. Be careful with small firms. Now, you may know that, at least some statistics show that small firms or smaller firms are very important to the Japanese economy. Some people say that about 50% or so of companies in Japan are made up of small firms. I don't want to make a great effort to convince you that small firms are very important also for Brazilian or other Latin American countries. Well, a third interesting case is the South African competition law. That's a very interesting case, very recent case. Unlike the German or the Japanese competition law, the South African competition law, it's a very recent experience. The Germany competition law were basically enacted after the Second World War, especially to face recession and recover from the war. The Japanese competition law also was mainly developed after the Second World War. Professor Aki-Singh claimed in his works. The Japanese competition law, especially in the 1950s to 1970s, were the more sensitive to small firms. But in South Africa, after the year 2000, it's a very recent regulation, several competition law has been enacted. So in the South African competition law, there is the objectives of competition law are the objectives emphasize economic development, small firm development, and protection for historically marginalized small firms. Let me just, I have a copy of this South Africa's competition law. As you can see there, the purpose of competition law in South Africa are as follows. For instance, in the item E, you could say the purpose of competition law is to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises have an equitable opportunity to participate in the economy. And then the F, to promote greater spread ownership, particularly to increase ownership states of historically disadvantaged persons. So that's a very interesting model to think about, and perhaps we can draw some lessons from these non-Anglo-American models of competition law and policy. Now, the next question that perhaps we might ask ourselves is, so if this is happening in Germany, in Japan, in South Africa, why is not happening in Latin America, where we have huge numbers of small firms, where small firms are very critical for these economies, where small firms provide jobs for low-income people, where small firms alleviate poverty, where small firms may be a very important source of innovation and industrialization? Why? Then why don't we adopt this type of competition policy? That's, I think, a question that's difficult to answer. But let me just give you one important reason why we haven't adopted adopted this type of competition policy. I think one central reason is that Latin American countries have been largely influenced by Anglo-American models of competition policy and law. What do we mean by Anglo-American models of competition? Well, basically, the primacy of the structured performance paradigm. You know, it's a neoclassical approach to competition law in which basically competition law is supposed to control abuse of market power, understood in terms of market share concentration and market price manipulation. We know that, we learned that in our basic course of economics, but that idea comes from the UK, from the United States, and even from Canada. That's the Anglo-American model. It was, as you know, it was basically detailed by the industrial economics, and then the Harvard School after the 1930s further developed that approach. In the 1970s, 1980s, the Chicago School even took that approach even further and made a more conservative approach. That's the Anglo-American model that has been very influential in Latin American countries. And perhaps we learned this model in our basic courses in micro and macroeconomics. So this is, to me, this is one of the central barriers, one of the central problems for not adopting a competition law that may be sensitive to small firms. So, but in the US, for instance, there has been, there is some sort of rejection, early rejection to this structured performance paradigm. And they, 4 years ago, the Federal Trade Commission has issued the 2000 guideline for cooperation among competitors. They are sort of recognizing that cooperation, not just simply fierce competition, but cooperation among firms may be very good for the economy. But that's a very late recognition. That's a very late retreat from the old tradition of the neoclassical approach to competition law and policy. But they are now focusing only on large firms. But the claim here is that we need perhaps to go beyond that and say our countries, our economies need to promote the cooperative networks among small firms, because that's very critical for these economies. And we need to abandon, perhaps, the part from this neoclassical approach to competition law that emphasizes too much fierce competition, monopolies, individual action, market price manipulation. That doesn't seem to be very helpful for our economies. And we need to perhaps say, you know what, that's a very interesting contribution, but that doesn't work in Latin America. That doesn't really help us to get out of poverty. That doesn't really, it's going to help us to industrialize our economies. We need to rethink this, and we're not going to follow you Anglo-American view of competition law. We need to develop our own approach to competition law and policy. So let me just conclude with this couple of ideas. So local economy development and industrialization requires that smaller firms cooperate among themselves. So the central message of this short presentation is to say that we need a radical departure from Anglo-American neoliberal models of competition policy in this continent. And perhaps we could build on the experience of Germany, Japan, Korea, and South Africa. Thanks very much.
É com grande satisfação que eu tenho a oportunidade de fazer esses comentários aos dois trabalhos e, particularmente, porque, no caso brasileiro especificamente, a política de concorrência não tem um foco definido no momento, ou melhor, a política de concorrência brasileira foi instituída com a intenção de mimetizar o paradigma liberal, e ela eventualmente se encontra, vamos esperar que ela se encontre num processo de revisão nesse momento. Então é oportuna a discussão. E eu gostaria também de ultrapassar o tema da política da concorrência e discutir em geral política de regulação e desenvolvimento em economia de desenvolvimento com referência ao Brasil. Eu quero me valer fundamentalmente do texto do professor Agite e começar reconhecendo o postulado fundamental do seu texto, que o processo de desenvolvimento só se desdobra na medida em que a taxa de investimento, a taxa de acumulação de capital, se mantenha por longos períodos em ritmo acelerado, portanto, que a acumulação de capital se processa em ritmo persistentemente acelerado ao longo do tempo, de forma a permitir o desenvolvimento pleno das potencialidades produtivas, industriais e tecnológicas das economias. Se supondo que a economia é uma economia capitalista, em se supondo, a sustentação de taxas de acumulação aceleradas em ciclo de longa duração requer a confiança, a consolidação de confiança no crescimento econômico e a capacidade de sustentar fluxos de lucro satisfatórios ao longo do tempo, num círculo virtuoso em que a sustentação do fluxo adequado de lucros consolida a confiança e a consolidação da confiança move decisões de investimento e, por sua vez, referendam a aceleração, a manutenção do crescimento e a realização dos lucros. Evidentemente, a taxa de retorno tem que ser suficiente e persistente para mover decisões privadas de investimento na direção da sua realização, da sua concretização. Ainda acresce o professor Agite que, além da sustentação de uma taxa de investimento firme ao longo do tempo, é indispensável que um processo de aprendizado competitivo, de inovação e de capacitação tecnológica acompanhe o desenvolvimento do setor privado. Portanto, é a combinação de um processo de inovação em que e aqui tomo de empréstimo uma observação do texto do professor Dan Staley, que ainda não foi discutido, em que o processo de investimento se combina com um incremento persistente da produtividade total dos fatores da economia, portanto, é capaz de gerar um incremento persistente de renda real, distribuível a lucros e salários, e, portanto, capaz de fazer desenvolver o mercado doméstico e, ao mesmo tempo, remunerar o capital. Esta combinação que só o processo de inovação persistente assegura, junto com a acumulação de capital, que é, digamos, um postulado fundamental para a compreensão dos processos de desenvolvimento. Muito bem. Dito isso, a pergunta é: as políticas de concorrência devem ser políticas com compatibilidade ou até, no limite, políticas subordinadas ao objetivo maior da sustentação do desenvolvimento, ou as políticas de concorrência, e eu diria as políticas em geral de regulação, deveriam ter outros objetivos próprios. A visão neoclássica, a visão neoliberal dominante, atribui às políticas de regulação e às políticas de concorrência um foco próprio. Qual é este foco? É a defesa, a suposta defesa de direitos difusos da sociedade, que não se manifestam de forma... direitos do consumidor ou direitos difusos que não se manifestam de maneira clara e de maneira taxativa para a opinião pública. Assim definido, o foco das políticas de regulação e da política de concorrência se desvia para uma maximização a curto prazo de bem-estar, supostamente de bem-estar dos consumidores, tendo como objetivo principal a transmissão de preços mais baixos, a transmissão dos ganhos de produtividade, dos ganhos de aumento da produtividade total de fatores para os consumidores através de preços mais baixos. Este objetivo fundamental se sobreporia, então, aos objetivos centrais da política de desenvolvimento. É este o debate essencial. Eu tenho, desde sempre, advogado que esta é uma falsa questão, na medida em que uma maximização de benefícios ao consumidor não pode ser pensada a curto prazo, nem pode ser pensada de maneira dissociada do processo de desenvolvimento e do processo de sustentação do desenvolvimento. Vale dizer, a promoção do bem-estar a longo prazo da sociedade transita pela sustentação de altas taxas de crescimento e de desenvolvimento, de mudança qualitativa, e isto deveria subordinar a busca a curto prazo de benefícios ao consumidor, ou seja, benefícios, a própria defesa de interesses difusos da sociedade, no meu ponto de vista, está muito mais próxima de uma estratégia de longo prazo de desenvolvimento do que uma visão distributivista de curto prazo de benefícios ao consumidor. Bom, tendo anunciado esta percepção básica, eu queria criticar ou sublinhar alguns dos pontos extremamente lúcidos colocados pelo paper do professor Singh e também pela contribuição do professor Salazar. O primeiro ponto é que o paradigma de mercado efetivamente, realmente dominante em qualquer economia é o oligopólio. A situação de concorrência, ou de concorrência perfeita, ou de concorrência atomizada, é uma exceção de exceções. O paradigma real no mundo é de um oligopólio. Os sistemas de mercado se organizam sob forma de oligopólio. O oligopólio é a forma predominante na estruturação das economias modernas. Aliás, sempre foi, mas enfim, o oligopólio sempre foi. Só a utopia da livre concorrência é algo que não existe na prática. Bom, se assim é, a pergunta é a seguinte: como que os oligopólios deveriam ser regulados? Essa é a pergunta dele. Faz sentido regular oligopólios? com que objetivos os oligopólios deveriam ser regulados? Uma economia em desenvolvimento. Se o objetivo central é promover o desenvolvimento sustentável da acumulação de capital, a regulação do oligopólio deveria se focar nas condições básicas de incentivo à manutenção de uma taxa elevada de acumulação de capital. Quais seriam? Rentabilidade e retorno satisfatório ao capital, confiança na capacidade privada, a construção de condições para que o setor privado tenha confiança nas condições de crescimento e, portanto, empreenda efetivamente decisões de investimento. Ora, se assim é, a regulação de monopólio deveria se preocupar com um pressuposto fundamental, que é manutenção de condições satisfatórias de rentabilidade para a acumulação privada. Segundo, condições de maximização da inovação a longo prazo. E, conjuntamente com isso, condições de sustentação e de maximização da produtividade total dos fatores a longo prazo, supondo que a produtividade total dos fatores a longo prazo só cresce com processos de inovação, tanto de processos quanto de produtos. São objetivos simultâneos. Ora, se isso é verdadeiro, o Dr. Singh inquire, pergunta, que paradigma de oligopólio foi bem sucedido historicamente e que paradigma de oligopólio maximizou taxa de inovação e taxa de acumulação? E ele responde com muita clareza que numa economia de desenvolvimento foi a política japonesa nos anos 50 até o início dos 70, a política essa mimetizada pela Coreia, mimetizada por outras economias asiáticas, foi a política que foi o exemplo histórico que mais se aproximou de uma maximização ao longo do tempo de condições de inovação e de aprendizado dinâmico. Ora, duas lições decorrem desta proposição. Primeiro, que a política adequada não é a política de criar campeões nacionais, no sentido de que a política ambiciona criar um grande grupo nacional dominante, mas sim a política mais bem sucedida foi a política de criar 2 ou 3 oligopolistas nacionais, ou seja, foi de criar uma estrutura de oligopólio com alta rivalidade. A estrutura de oligopólio com alta rivalidade é mais eficiente em termos de uma concorrência criativa e inovadora entre estes oligopolistas do que uma política de campeão nacional que tenderia a criar um monopolista nacional e, portanto, a política deveria ser a política de concorrência deveria não só tolerar, mais do que tolerar, a política de concorrência deveria promover a criação de oligopólios. Reconhecer que o oligopólio é a forma dominante e promover o oligopólio com rivalidade. Uma nota de cautela que o professor Singh repete no seu texto em vários momentos. Atenção, a rivalidade dentro de uma construção de oligopólio é fundamental para mover o oligopólio numa direção de dinamismo tecnológico e concorrencial, porém, a partir de um certo momento, a competição oligopolista pode ser excessiva. Eu digo o seguinte: não há nada mais concorrencial do que uma estrutura oligopolista. Né? O paradigma da concorrência perfeita é um paradigma de concorrência suave. Não há nada mais furiosamente concorrencial do que um monopólio com alta rivalidade. Monopólios com alta rivalidade frequentemente produzem corridas de investimento competitivo entre si, reações agressivas de formação de capacidade à frente dos concorrentes, que resultam frequentemente em criação de capacidade ociosa não planejada e guerras de preços. Exemplos portanto, de que a concorrência entre oligopólios, ela precisa ser calibrada, deveria ser calibrada pela política de concorrência para que ela chegue em dois objetivos. O objetivo deve ser maximizar a taxa de inovação e maximizar a taxa de acumulação ao longo do tempo. E, portanto, o excesso, tanto a falta de concorrência pode ser perniciosa dentro dos oligopólios, como o excesso de concorrência é frequentemente pernicioso ao oligopólio, se o objetivo é a sustentação ao longo do tempo de uma alta taxa de acumulação. Bom, então, isto redefine e coloca para a política de concorrência uma tarefa nova, que seria a da otimização da rivalidade oligopolista. Essa deveria ser uma das tarefas da política de concorrência. Isto significa que a política de concorrência deveria se preocupar com incentivo à inovação técnica. Deveria se preocupar e olhar condições de entrada e saída. Isso tem a ver com condições de financiamento. E com regulação da tarifa aduaneira, regulação da proteção, com a criação de formas de cooperação quando necessário. Forma de cooperação tecnológica. Antes, os japoneses praticaram com grande eficiência cooperação tecnológica pré-concorrencial entre as grandes empresas para habilitar as empresas japonesas a dominarem o ciclo de microeletrônica e de software necessários a capacitar a sua indústria a ser uma indústria contemporânea em tecnologia de informação. Esses esquemas de cooperação e os esquemas de cooperação mencionados aqui pelo professor Salazar entre pequenas empresas ou para contrabalançar o poder de mercado de grandes empresas ou para criar arranjos produtivos locais ou clusters de pequenas empresas inovadoras. Essas são tarefas de uma política de concorrência. E em enunciando essas tarefas de uma política de concorrência, na verdade, o que nós nos aproximamos é que se aproximam os objetivos da política de concorrência de objetivos da política industrial ou de uma política industrial e tecnológica. Ou seja, é essencial que a política de concorrência e a política industrial e tecnológica sejam políticas não só compatíveis, mas como sejam políticas estreitamente coordenadas entre si. Nesse sentido, eu diria que, fazendo uma discussão à parte, que a regulação de monopólios naturais ou a regulação de setores em que, por razões de economia de escala a nível da empresa e relativas ao tamanho de mercado, a tendência é realmente a monopolização, se impõe sim uma tarefa de regulação a monopólios privados ou a monopólios naturais em economia de desenvolvimento, em que igualmente os objetivos da regulação de monopólios deveriam ser objetivos de longo prazo, em que a taxa de investimento, de inovação, de ganhos de produtividade deveriam estar associadas à supervisão de qualidade e de forma compatível com a questão de preços. Quando se prioriza a questão de controle de preços ou de regulação de preços através de vários modelos, como o modelo do price cap ou outros modelos, sem olhar o conjunto do processo de investimento e de inovação numa economia em desenvolvimento, a tendência é subestimar objetivos fundamentais. Quer dizer, em geral, infraestruturas e serviços públicos que são monopólios naturais em economias em desenvolvimento têm como ponto de partida uma necessidade de expansão acelerada que não está presente em economias desenvolvidas. Se essas infraestruturas já são suficientes e plenamente desenvolvidas, aí sim a preocupação distributiva poderia eventualmente ser entronizada como a preocupação número 1. Mas enquanto essas infraestruturas são insuficientes, ao contrário, a preocupação deveria ser fundamental de compatibilizar essas políticas de controle com as políticas de incentivo e de sustentação de investimentos e de inovação ao longo do tempo. Portanto, não vejo uma distinção, salvo o fato de que os monopólios naturais são um caso extremo por razões econômicas, de economia de escala, são um caso especial da mesma política de concorrência que deveria ter objetivos fundamentais de promoção do desenvolvimento. Tendo feito essa nota, eu queria trazer a discussão um pouco para o caso brasileiro. No caso brasileiro, a lei de concorrência, a Lei 8884, de 1994, é uma lei que foi baixada no governo Itamar Franco, num momento até de grande irritação do presidente com o setor farmacêutico. Num momento de grande irritação, o presidente Itamar Franco encarregou o ministro da Justiça, Maurício Correia, de produzir um projeto de lei que foi negociado no Congresso, e daí resultou uma lei cujo objetivo, inspirada, na verdade, lá atrás, na famosa Lei Delegada número 4, que era uma lei do Congresso Nacional. Aqui eu estou vendo dois amigos que trabalharam com isso, o Zé Carlos Braga, que foi secretário à época da SEAP, do acompanhamento do preço do Ministério da Fazenda, e o Boni, que conhecem esse arcabouço. A lei, na verdade, é uma lei que tinha como grande objetivo, tinha mais como objetivo a questão de controle de preços e de criação de condições de controle. Porém, a lei contém alguns artigos, embora essa lei eventualmente mereça reforma, ela contém alguns artigos que permitem conciliá-la com uma estratégia de desenvolvimento. Fundamentalmente, embora eu creia que a lei deveria ser revisitada, ela contém em alguns artigos a orientação de que os ganhos de eficiência econômica devem entre aspas, perdoar ou fazer tolerar níveis de concentração altos. Ou seja, níveis de concentração elevados devem ser aceitos pelo CAD ou pelo Sistema de Defesa da Concorrência, desde que permitam a realização de ganhos de eficiência. Portanto, através desse reconhecimento do papel fundamental de ganhos de eficiência, é possível fazer convergir a lei de concorrência com uma política industrial. Obviamente, se coloca aqui, e de imediato, e aqui outra vez faço referência ao texto extremamente lúcido do professor Agir Singh, de que eficiência nós estamos falando? De que eficiência nós estamos falando? Se nós estamos falando de ganhos de eficiência estáticos de curto prazo, esta interpretação terá pouca serventia. Se nós estamos falando de ganhos de eficiência estáticos, dificilmente nós poderemos conciliar a lei de concorrência com a política industrial. Se nós estivermos interpretando ganhos de eficiência como ganhos de eficiência dinâmicos, ganhos de eficiência que correspondem ao processo de aprendizado, de capacitação a longo prazo, então seria possível conciliar. Diga-se de passagem, os manuais de análise que instruem os processos de defesa da concorrência, que ainda estão em vigor, manuais de análise das SEAI, da Secretaria de Acompanhamento Econômico do Ministério da Fazenda, e da Secretaria de Direito Econômico, são manuais copiados do Banco Mundial ou de paradigmas inspirados pelo Banco Mundial, e são manuais muito pobres. Um manualzinho manda analisar a estrutura de mercado, verificar as elasticidades de demanda e de oferta, as condições de entrada, e faz uma sequência de análise em que, se existe aumento da concentração, e se esse aumento da concentração econômica aumenta a probabilidade de exercício unilateral de poder de mercado, ele tende a condenar ou a mandar desfazer uma operação de concentração, sem que a análise de eficiências econômicas fique claramente elucidada. Ou seja, não existe, infelizmente, na política de concorrência brasileira, um paradigma estabelecido de análise de eficiência econômica, de condições de eficiência econômica. Seria o momento adequado, porque o governo atual pretende enviar um projeto de lei à Câmara para reformular a lei de concorrência e reformular o sistema da concorrência, embora esse projeto de lei não tenha sido ainda trazido à consulta pública, seria um momento adequado para se levar essa discussão a fundo. Portanto, os textos aqui trazidos são extremamente oportunos, porque eles chegam, a contribuição do professor Singh, num momento muito apropriado para essa discussão. Enfim, eu tendo dito isso até o momento, irei agora, de maneira muito rápida, dizer como a política industrial e a política de concorrência poderiam ser conciliadas numa economia em desenvolvimento, e por que as políticas industriais, diferentemente do paradigma clássico, do paradigma neoliberal, precisam necessariamente ser políticas verticais. Eu queria insistir nisso. A necessidade de políticas verticais, e aqui se contrapõe, outra vez, ao approach multilateral, de que as políticas devem ser homogêneas e apenas horizontais, vem do reconhecimento de que as economias de escala, as condições de entrada, as economias de integração vertical entre elos de uma cadeia produtiva, as externalidades, as características e a dinâmica dos mercados, ciclo de produto, características do produto, e principalmente porque as características e a dinâmica do progresso técnico, tipo, taxa de investimento típica sobre vendas, risco dos processos de inovação, dinâmica do processo de aprendizado, todas essas condições são específicas. A combinação de todas essas condições é específica a cada cadeia industrial. É impossível dar um tratamento homogêneo à estruturação de cadeias que reúnem condições específicas. É muito forte. Há, entretanto, necessidade de que as políticas industriais tenham um componente vertical ou cadeia, e isto implica na necessidade de proteção tarifária seletiva. A proteção tarifária, embora não deva ser necessária, eu discorde, obviamente, de proteções tarifárias excessivamente altas que criam condições de conforto e de monopólio ou de reserva de mercado, sem contestação. Não obstante, a proteção seletiva continua sendo um instrumento indispensável, ou seja, o argumento da indústria nascente continua indispensável dentro da política de proteção. Segundo, obviamente que a proteção deve ter contrapartidas, prazos definidos, ela deve ser idealmente cadente ao longo do tempo. Segundo ponto fundamental, uma política industrial requer incentivos fiscais à inovação tecnológica. E esses incentivos fiscais à inovação tecnológica, que são praticados por todas as economias desenvolvidas, também precisam ser seletivos. Eles não podem ser homogêneos. Eles devem conter uma margem de seletividade possível por cadeias industriais, porque as características do processo de inovação são profundamente distintas entre cadeias industriais. Outro requisito fundamental é coordenação. Coordenação que deve ser promovida pelo Estado ou entre o Estado e o setor privado. E outras, e finalmente, não posso deixar de sublinhar, duas condições macro. Uma é uma taxa de câmbio estimulante à competitividade de preços. A taxa de câmbio não pode ser uma taxa de câmbio sistematicamente apreciada e punitiva para a competitividade de preços. Vale dizer o seguinte: dado o estado de desenvolvimento tecnológico e de custos, a taxa de câmbio precisa garantir um nível mínimo de competitividade de preços à exportação dos países em desenvolvimento. Obviamente, à medida que os países em desenvolvimento acumulam ganhos de produtividade, a taxa de câmbio poderia apreciar um pouquinho, mas ela nunca deveria ser punitiva à competitividade de preço. E, finalmente, condições de financiamento. As condições de financiamento de longo prazo, dada a notória ausência de uma base doméstica de financiamento nas economias em desenvolvimento, com a notável exceção, outra vez, das economias asiáticas, que construíram sua própria base doméstica de financiamento, é um suporte fundamental à política industrial. E, outra vez, as políticas de financiamento devem ter poder devem ter margem de manobra para realizar operações setoriais. Eu diria até reestruturações patrimoniais setoriais, que é um item muito sensível e que tem diretamente a ver com a política de concorrência. Na medida em que a política de desenvolvimento promova reestruturações setoriais, que eventualmente sejam concentradoras dos mercados, essas políticas deveriam estar intimamente coordenadas à política Em suma, embora a política industrial não possa mais ser uma política de incentivo, intensiva em superproteção, intensiva em incentivos fiscais, ela tem que conter todos esses ingredientes que eu assinalei antes, acrescidos ainda da diplomacia comercial e da promoção comercial externa. Nenhuma das economias em desenvolvimento pode abrir mão de uma política comercial externa em que o Estado ajudou ao acesso, a abrir acesso a mercados e ajudou a contrabalançar as pressões internacionais com relação à questão de acesso a mercados. Eu creio que aí eu faço referência aos textos do professor Chang, extremamente lúcido nesse aspecto, em que ele denuncia com toda a clareza. Para fazer política de desenvolvimento não se pede, se constrói. Tá? E eu vejo que eu vejo o seguinte, as economias